Rough month for Bitcoin. The cryptocurrency down about 25% over the last several weeks, dipping below 60,000 last Friday. Join us now for more on the Bitcoin slump. Anthony Pompliano, ProCap Financial Chairman and CEO. There's 4-year crypto or Bitcoin winners. Pomp, is that how you calculate it? And you hear the same thing every 4 years when there's a drawdown, and that is that this time it's really going to zero. And you say every time that happens, it's like clockwork, and it usually a pretty good bottom.
Look, I think there's a lot of debate about whether the 4-year cycle was real or not. Was the institutional participation, the ETFs, was that going to change this 4-year cycle? But again, I think that peaking in October of last year, continuing to see the drawdown into this year, more and more people are convinced that that 4-year cycle is a real thing.
Yeah, and are you? And what can we learn from history, and why would it be the same this time? Why would you argue that it would be the same thing? I guess you're arguing that it's at a point down more than 50%. Is it finding a place where it should be bought right now, in your view?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things to pay attention to, right? First is there's timeline. And so peaking in October and drawing down now, that would line up with that 4-year cycle. But one of the things that we have seen is that this is one of the best bear markets. And usually you don't want to celebrate when an asset is going down. But what we have seen is that we are starting to hit a number of metrics that historically have actually signaled we're near the bottom of a bear market, but it's doing it without the 80% drawdown. Now, Bitcoin is still down 50+%. And so it doesn't feel good for the people who are holding Bitcoin. But I do think that these bear markets are getting shallower, which also means that the volatility overall of the asset are dampening. And a lot of that is because you have the institutional participation. You know, if you go and you look at Bitcoin itself, one of the things that I think people are starting to talk about, there's a guy, Benjamin Cohen, who's come out and said the percent of Bitcoin that is held that is underwater is now larger than the percent of Bitcoin that is held that is in profit. And that usually is a pretty good signal that we are near the bottom of a bear market. And so I think that a lot of the Bitcoiners are starting to say, okay, you know, it's drawn down enough. I'm going to start accumulating now.
You follow what Michael Saylor or Strategy does? Do you know exactly what they've done, or does anyone know exactly what they've done? They sold a little Bitcoin, but then I heard that they're buying at the same time, or you know, when he sold, people said, oh, he said he'd never sell. I don't know if he ever really said he'd never sell any. It was a small amount, but you know, there is concerns that some leveraged entities that hold a lot of Bitcoin, at some point, if it went down enough, there might be issues.
Yeah, look, Michael Saylor is obviously a very smart guy. I think he's been pretty transparent explaining what he's going to do. You know, people forget that before he bought Bitcoin, he came out and he said, hey, we're looking at a bunch of different assets to put onto our balance sheet. Bitcoin was one of many. He then went and he bought Bitcoin. Same thing here is a couple of weeks before he sold these 32 Bitcoin, he started talking about the fact that he may sell some. And so I think he's pretty good about telegraphing to the market what he's going to go do. Now, in terms of leveraged entities, obviously that some of the past bear markets have definitely been magnified by whether it was FTX or other organizations that just kind of got over their skis. What I do find, I think, interesting about both Strategy and maybe even Strive, who also has these preferreds out there, they have these dollar reserves that can actually hold them over from a dividend perspective without having to sell the Bitcoin. And so I think that whenever you have leverage, there's obviously risk. People should go and they should really look into this. But I do think that folks are trying to be incredibly intelligent about those dollar reserves, and that should give a lot of folks who are holding those assets probably more comfort than if it was just Bitcoin without the dollar reserve.
All right, the debasement trade that people say both gold and Bitcoin would benefit from. We have a inflation number coming out today that supposedly is important for gold or for Bitcoin. We want easy money, not we, but if you own Bitcoin, you want easy money and the debasement of the currency and printing, and you want an accommodative Fed. Inflation causes the Fed not to cut rates, and I think that's one of the reasons that gold hasn't acted as well, Bitcoin has not acted as well. There's no rate cuts likely forthcoming at this point. Doesn't that hurt the argument for Bitcoin? And then why would inflation help bolster Bitcoin or the prospects for Bitcoin?
Yeah, what's pretty interesting is we have this AI CFO called CFO Sylvia. We've got thousands of multimillionaires who have gone in and they've put their portfolios into this product. And so we can see on an anonymized basis, how much gold, how much Bitcoin or crypto are people actually holding. We find about 10% of all assets on the platform are crypto. And a big reason of that is some people are looking for kind of a baited attack or some sort of speculation. But I do believe a lot of it is actually because people are worried about the debasement of the dollar. And so if you go and you look, if there's not going to be interest rate cuts, obviously that can serve somewhat as a headwind. But I think that just because we don't get interest rate cuts doesn't mean that the government's national debt is not going up or that there's undisciplined, kind of fiscal policy. And so ultimately what I believe is happening here is there may be some short-term headwinds because people aren't going to see rates go back down to 0% as we saw over the last few years. But I do believe that people still are very long-term convicted that the government cannot stop printing money. They can't stop printing money. They're going to debase the dollar. If the dollar gets debased, then you're going to want to own assets. Assets like Bitcoin and gold are going to do very well over a long period of time. And so I think that an entire generation woke up to that fact during COVID. They now are convinced, and there's pretty much no data point you're going to show them that is going to convince them otherwise. And so you're going to have persistent flows into Bitcoin and gold, for decades to come as this generation comes into more and more money.